talking corpses, elevators that move on their own, and spirits that refuse to move on. These are morgue horror stories that will mess with your head and everything you think you know about the afterlife. Like in the story you're about to hear, where a forensic tech witnesses the impossible. The body of a murdered man starts whispering secrets, and maybe even revealing a conspiracy bigger than death itself. But before we get into the story, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss a terrifying tale. The body on table 23 wouldn't stop whispering. I've been working at the Blackmore County Morgue for nearly 10 years, and I swear I've seen it all. Bodies in unrecognizable states, accidents that defy logic, even a couple of cases that made the most seasoned doctors lose their lunch. But nothing prepared me for what happened with Edmund Whitcomb. He arrived on a Tuesday, the victim of a botched robbery, or so the report said. Whitcomb had one side of his head crushed in, as if someone had hit him repeatedly with something heavy. But what caught my attention right away was his mouth. Rigor mortis had already set in, and yet his lips were parted, frozen in a crooked half-smile, as if he had died mid-sentence. Strange, but not impossible. You see all kinds of things in this place, so even that seemed normal. Then I closed the drawer and heard the first whisper, a low sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the direction of the body. It sounded like static, the kind you ignore because the morgue has an old ventilation system that's always making noise. But when I turned around, the sound stopped. I stood there, holding the clipboard, trying to convince myself it had been my imagination, until it came again. This time, there was no denying it. It was a voice, his voice. It came straight from table 23, as if someone were speaking from inside the body. My blood ran cold, but the worst was yet to come. As I approached, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest, I saw Whitcomb's mouth moving. It wasn't a hallucination. His lips, locked by rigor mortis, were slowly closing, as if trying to form words. And then, clear as a bell, came the whisper. They covered it up. I jumped back, nearly knocking over the instrument tray. That voice wasn't human, or at least, not from someone alive. It was rough, filled with a weight that didn't come from lungs but from something deeper, something that didn't belong in this world. At that moment, I thought about calling someone, but who would believe me? Oh yeah, the corpse on table 23 decided to chat with me today. I'd end up in a psych ward before the end of my shift. So I took a deep breath, slammed the drawer shut, and got out of there as if the devil himself were on my heels. But the nightmare didn't stop there. The next day, Whitcomb's autopsy report was gone. It wasn't in the system, it wasn't in the pile of documents, it wasn't anywhere. And I knew I had filled out that damn paper because I had put it in the file drawer myself. I asked everyone, searched the room, but nothing. It was as if his case had never existed. And then the messages started. My phone vibrated in my pocket as I washed my hands, and when I looked, it was an unknown number. Just one message. 23. I deleted it right away. Coincidence, right? Until 2 hours later, another one came. 23 and another 23. No explanation, no context. Just that number, repeated like a reminder. The number of the drawer where Whitcomb's body had been. That night, I swore I heard the whispers again, even after I had gone home. They came from some dark corner of my apartment, as if someone were there, breathing in my ear, repeating the same phrase. They covered it up. And when I opened the closet the next day, I saw the proof that I wasn't crazy. A single bloody fingerprint, fresh on the inside of the door, as if someone or something had been there, waiting. And the worst part? It matched Edmund Whitcomb's left hand. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The fingerprint on the closet door was the last straw. This wasn't a coincidence, it wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. Something was happening, and Edmund Whitcomb, or whatever was left of him, wasn't going to leave me alone until I uncovered the truth. That night, I returned to the morgue alone. The place is creepy during the day, but at midnight, it feels like the walls are breathing. Every sound echoes like a moan, and the darkness in the corridors seems thicker, as if it's trying to hide something. I knew it was risky, but I needed to see Whitcomb's body again. Maybe there was something I had missed before, some detail that would explain what the hell was going on. But when I got to the cold room, drawer 23 was empty. The body was gone. My stomach turned. No one removes a corpse without paperwork, without notice, without anything. And yet, there was no record, no note, no email. I asked the security guard if anyone had come to retrieve the body, and he looked at me like I was crazy. "No one came in here today," he said. That's when I heard the noise, something dragging in the back corridor where the old equipment is kept. A wet, heavy sound, as if someone were dragging themselves across the floor. I followed the noise, my cell phone flashlight trembling in my hand, until I reached a storage room we hardly ever use anymore. The door was ajar. When I pushed it open, the smell hit me first. That odor of rotting flesh, mixed with something sweet, almost chemical. And then I saw him. Edmund Whitcomb was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall, his head tilted forward as if he were sleeping. But corpses don't move. They don't sit. They don't whisper. And then slowly his head lifted. His eyes were cloudy, opaque, but his mouth opened again. That same frozen expression I had seen before. This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, raspy voice, coming from lungs that shouldn't have been working. "You're going to help me." I nearly fell backward. My instinct screamed at me to run, but something held me in place. Maybe it was terror, maybe it was curiosity, but I needed to know. "Who did this to you?" I asked, my voice barely a thread. His lips moved again, but now the words came out haltingly, as if they were being forced out. "They killed me. It wasn't a robbery." A chill ran down my spine. I had always thought his injuries were too strange for a simple robbery. The brutality, the way his head had been crushed, it seemed personal. "Who?" Before he could answer, the lights flickered. I heard rapid footsteps in the corridor, as if several people were running toward the room. Whitcomb thrashed, his eyes wide with a terror I had never seen in a corpse before. "They know you're here," he groaned. "Run." And then, the lights went out. In the dark, I heard Whitcomb's body writhing, falling to the floor with a wet thud. Someone, or something, entered the room, and I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, stumbling through the corridors, until I fell outside the morgue, gasping for air. When I looked back, the lights were on again, and the door was locked. The next day, Whitcomb's body was back in drawer 23, as if nothing had happened. But I knew the truth now. Someone had killed him, and it wasn't some random thief. And worse, they knew I was onto them. They weren't going to let me escape that easily. After that night, everything changed. Messages with the number 23 popped up on my phone constantly. Sometimes they were just numbers. Other times they were blurry photos of places I recognized. The morgue, my car, even the front of my building. Someone was watching me. And then came the invitation. An anonymous envelope left on my desk. Inside, a card with a single phrase, "Do you really want to know the truth?" And an address, an abandoned warehouse in the Port District. It was a trap, I knew. But after what Whitcomb had told me, I had no choice. I arrived at midnight. The place was dark, full of shadows that moved wrong. And in the middle of the main bay, in a chair, was the body of Edmund Whitcomb. Again. But this time he wasn't alone. 3 figures in black suits surrounded him, motionless as statues. When they saw me, one of them smiled. "You should have left it alone," he said, his voice icy. That's when Whitcomb stood up. This time it wasn't a corpse twitching. It was something worse. His eyes glowed in the dark, and when he opened his mouth, a scream that wasn't human came out. The lights exploded, glass shattered. And in the midst of the chaos, I felt a cold hand grab my arm. It was Whitcomb. "Run," he growled, throwing me toward the exit. I didn't think twice. When I looked back, I saw the men in black being dragged into the shadows, and Whitcomb standing in the middle of them, with a smile that wasn't his own. The next day, the morgue was normal. No missing bodies, no altered records. But in my pocket I found a crumpled piece of paper with a single word. "Thank you." Edmund Whitcomb finally rested. But me? To this day, when the phone rings in the middle of the night, I still tremble. Because sometimes the number 23 appears on the screen, and I never answer. How bizarre. I want to know what you thought of the story. What rating from 0 to 10 would you give it? Leave your opinion here in the comments. When a body speaks even after death, you start to doubt everything. What's real? What's possible? But that's nothing compared to what happened with a corpse. That was in search of its own heart. The story you're about to see seems like it's straight out of a nightmare, but it was lived by someone who was never the same afterward. The smell of formaldehyde never left me. Not even after 10 years working in that decaying funeral home, tucked away in the back of a forgotten Louisiana alley. But nothing prepared me for what arrived that rainy night. It was nearly midnight when the ambulance dumped the body at our door. A tall guy, drenched in swamp water, his skin pale as if he'd been under that muck for months. What caught my attention most were the eyes. Open, glazed, as if they were still seeing. Mr. LeBlanc, the owner of the place, did that thing he does, rubbing his chin while staring at the corpse. "This one ain't from around here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. And I should have listened. We had a makeshift morgue in the basement, full of old equipment and a flickering light as if it were scared. That's where I took the body, laying him on the cold metal table. The first thing I noticed was that he had no external injuries, no stab wounds, gunshots, or strangulation marks. But when I turned him to the side, that's when my blood turned to ice. There was a hole in his chest, clean, rounded, as if someone had reached in and yanked something out. And I knew exactly what was missing. The heart. I laughed right then, nervously of course. I've worked with the dead for years, seen it all, drownings, car accidents, even a guy who exploded in a factory. But a corpse without a heart? That was new. LeBlanc stayed quiet, his dark eyes fixed on that hole. "Don't mess with this one," he said and left quickly, as if the place had suddenly become too small for him. I should have left too, but I'm stubborn. I grabbed the instruments and started the examination, trying to figure out how the hell someone loses their heart without a single tear in the skin. That's when I felt it, a chill, the kind that crawls up your spine and sticks to the back of your neck, like something was breathing in your ear. I looked around, but the basement was empty, just me, the corpse, and the flickering light. Until his arm moved. It wasn't a spasm, not a post-mortem contraction. It was deliberate. His fingers stretched, the joints cracking, and his hand slapped the table with a thud that echoed in my head. I froze, and then he spoke. "Where is my heart?" The voice came out ragged, as if it had traveled through a very, very deep tunnel. I took a step back, but my feet felt glued to the floor. His eyes, once lifeless, now stared at me, and I swear by all that's holy, they were black, not dark. Black, as if someone had filled the sockets with ink. The table shook as he sat up, slowly, as if every movement hurt. His mouth opened again and I smelled it, not the stench of dead flesh. Something older, wet earth, rotting leaves, the swamp. "You have it." I didn't understand. Not right away. Until I remembered. The other body that came in last week, a vagrant no one claimed. His heart had something strange. Dark spots, almost like black veins. I kept it in a jar to examine later. And now this heartless corpse was staring at me, and I knew he wasn't going to ask again. That's when he got off the table. I didn't think. I just ran. The sound of his feet hitting the floor behind me was wrong, heavy but fast, as if the body didn't obey the laws of physics. I took the basement stairs 3 at a time, nearly slipping on the rusted metal. The morgue door slammed behind me, and I locked the handle with a steel hook, my hands shaking. On the other side, something scratched the wood. "Give it back." His voice came in whispers, but it was as if it were inside my head. I looked at the shelf at the back of the room where the jar with the vagrant's heart was kept. The thing inside it now pulsed, slowly, as if it had woken up. The hook on the door began to bend. I lunged toward the shelf, grabbing the jar with both hands to keep it from falling. The heart was warm, and the black veins now spread like roots, filling the preserving liquid with a murky red. Crash. The door fell. He was there, standing, the hole in his chest oozing a dark liquid that dripped onto the floor. The eyes. God, those eyes never left me. He took a step. Heart. Another step. I backed up until I hit the wall. There was nowhere else to run, and that's when I understood. It wasn't the vagrant's heart he wanted. It was his own. Someone had put another heart in the swamp corpse, and the original was here in my hand, who knows for how long. The jar suddenly felt heavy, as if something inside it were pulling toward him, and then the light went out. In the dark, I only heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and a cold whisper in my ear. You know where it is. The light came back with a snap, but the jar was no longer in my hand. He held it now, his muddy fingers clenched around the glass like claws. The heart inside pulsed violently, the black veins writhing like snakes. I expected him to devour it, or shove it back into that empty chest, but he just smiled. "It's not yours," he growled, and then smashed the jar against his own chest. The glass shattered, but instead of blood, a thick, dark mist gushed from the wound. The smell of sulfur and stagnant water filled the air. The floor trembled, and for a second, just a second, I saw something moving within that mist. Elongated shapes, pale arms stretching as if trying to escape from something. He raised his head and moaned, not in pain, but in relief. The hole in his chest began to close, the flesh regenerating in serpentine movements, until only a black hand-shaped scar remained. "Now it is complete," he whispered. And then he looked at me. There was no more hatred in those eyes, just an ancient weariness, like that of a man who had finally fulfilled a long journey. The mist around him began to dissipate, taking with it the stench of decay. "The pact is fulfilled," he said, and for the first time his voice sounded human. Before I could ask what pact, he dissolved, not like smoke but like sand carried by the wind. In seconds, there was nothing but a trail of mud on the floor and the broken jar at my feet. Mr. LeBlanc appeared at the door minutes later, pale, holding an old leather-bound book. He looked at the trail of mud, then at me, and without saying a word, shook his head. "It wasn't his," he muttered. "It was theirs." That night he burned the book in the furnace and disappeared from town. I never saw him again, but sometimes when the light flickers in the morgue and the swamp smell invades the air, I feel them out there, in the dark corners, just beyond sight, waiting. And I never again kept a heart that wasn't mine. What a fright. After dealing with a body that moves and talks, you'd think nothing else could surprise you. But sometimes what scares you the most is the silence, especially when it's broken by a lullaby playing on its own. Like in the story you're about to see, where twin sisters seemed not to accept death as the end. That night I swore the twins had smiled at me. I had been working at the Santa Clara morgue for nearly 10 years when they arrived. Two identical sisters, killed in a car accident so violent that even the medical examiners were puzzled by how intact the bodies were. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, and their black hair fell in perfect curls over their shoulders, as if someone had carefully arranged each strand after death. But the strangest thing? Their eyes. Still open. Always open. On the first day, everything went as usual. I prepared the bodies, filled out the paperwork, closed the drawers. Up to that point, it was just another night at the morgue. But when I returned in the early hours to check the refrigeration, I felt something different in the air. A heavy energy, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand on end for no reason. And that's when I heard it. Music. So faint that I almost thought it was my imagination. A soft, repetitive melody, like those lullabies your grandmother used to sing when you were a child. But there were no children there. There was no one there. The freezer door was locked, the corridor lights flickering weakly, and that voice, That voice came from nowhere. I approached the drawers where the twins were, and for a moment, I swore I heard a whisper. "Sister." Her hand was different. I swear I had left their arms crossed over their chests, as we always do. But now the first twin's right hand was stretched out, her thin, pale fingers almost touching the steel lid of the drawer, as if she were trying to push it from the inside. My heart raced in my throat, but I took a deep breath. It's the cold. The body contracted, it happens. But it doesn't happen. It has never happened like that. I went to the monitoring room to check the cameras. Nothing. Just the static images of the closed drawers. But when I returned, the second twin also had her hand out of place. This time, her fingers were intertwined with her sister's, as if they were holding each other. And the music was louder. The next morning, I mentioned it to the security guard, a tough guy who laughed and said I must have been drinking. But on the second day, he disappeared from the night shift and never came back. He didn't even collect his belongings. The other employees started whispering. They said the morgue had cold spots, areas where the temperature suddenly dropped for no reason, even with the system working perfectly. Once, the thermometer read 37 degrees in the middle of summer, while the rest of the city was melting at 104 degrees. And the whispers continued, always at the same time, always in the same way. "Sister, where are you?" a voice responded, coming from another drawer. "I'm here." I looked again, and the bodies were closer, as if every night someone was pushing them toward each other. Until, on the third night I saw them. I was tidying up the preparation room when I felt that chill on the back of my neck, that shiver you can't mistake. When I turned around, they were there, standing at the end of the corridor in white dresses with dark eyes fixed on me, translucent as if they were made of mist and faint light. The first one reached out her hand, not to me, but to her sister. And then, they smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a smile of relief. It was a wrong smile, the kind that knows something you don't. And before I could scream, run, do anything, the lights went out. When they came back on, the corridor was empty, but the drawers where they had been were open. I never should have opened that drawer. That night, the morgue was quieter than usual. Even the usual noises, the hum of the freezers, the creaking of the doors, seemed to have vanished. Only that heavy silence remained, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I knew I should call someone, a supervisor, the police, anyone. But something pulled me toward the open drawers. The twins' bodies were still there, but now they were face down, as if they had turned themselves in the dark. The music returned. This time it wasn't just a lullaby. It was a voice, clear and cold, humming words in some language I didn't understand. And worse, it came from inside the drawer. My pulse trembled as I reached out to pull the first twin back into position. The touch of her skin made me recoil. She wasn't cold as a corpse should be. She was icy, that kind of cold that burns, like touching metal in winter. And when my fingers touched her wrist, thump. A pulse. Weak, but there. I let out a scream and stepped back, almost tripping over my own feet. It wasn't possible. They were dead. I had seen the reports, the cuts, the documents. But then, I heard it again. Thump. It was the other one. The second twin. Her heart was also beating. That's when I realized the whispers weren't coming from the air. They came from them, from their blue lips that moved slowly, as if they were talking to each other. And their fingers. Their fingers were intertwining again, pulling each other as if trying to get up. I ran to the phone, dialing random numbers, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the device. But the line was dead. Not even static, just silence. And then the lights flickered. When they came back on, the twins were no longer in the drawers. They were standing in the middle of the room, hand in hand, and their eyes were open. They just wanted to be together but at what cost? I froze. The twins weren't looking at me. Their glazed eyes were fixed on each other, as if they were seeing each other for the first time. The music now came from them, a low hum that made my teeth tremble. And the cold. God, the cold was so intense that my breath came out in white clouds. The closest one turned her head slowly, the bones in her neck cracking like old wood. When her lips parted, a voice came out that wasn't hers. It was theirs, mixed, distorted. "We need to be complete," the sister echoed without moving her mouth. "Only one piece is missing." They took a step toward me. I backed up until I hit the wall, my hands desperately searching for something to defend myself. The closest one stretched out her arm, and that's when I saw her wrist had a clean cut, as if something important had been removed. The other raised her left hand, and in it was a scalpel. It wasn't one of those we use in the morgue. It was old, rusty, with dark stains on the blade. "You can help us," they whispered together. "You know how to join what has been separated." My vision blurred. Suddenly I was no longer in the morgue. I was in a decaying operating room with walls stained a dark red. The twins were on a table, tied up, screaming, while someone in a dirty lab coat raised the same scalpel. The flashback ended as quickly as it had begun. They were now a palm's length away from me. That's when the security radio exploded into static behind me, and a voice shouted, "Run!" I didn't think. I threw a chair between us and desperately ran down the corridor. The lights burst behind me one by one, and in the brief flashes I saw them. Not walking, but gliding, always hand in hand. I reached the emergency door when I heard the noise. A wet click. I turned for an instant. The first twin had the scalpel embedded in her own chest, cutting something that dripped black onto the floor. The other smiled. "Thank you." The door closed behind me. I never set foot in that place again. The next day, the bodies had vanished. The morgue was closed and the rumors grew. They say that to this day, on cold nights, you can hear music coming from the abandoned building. And if you look through the broken windows, sometimes you see two shadows, finally complete, dancing in the dark. Creepy, huh? The twins became a local legend. But what happens when the terror doesn't come from ghosts, but from your own workplace? Next, an experienced embalmer recounts something that made even him doubt his own sanity. But before we continue with the story, if you've made it this far, it means you're enjoying our stories, so go ahead and like to let YouTube know you enjoy this type of content, and don't miss any more horror stories. I always say the dead have strange ways of communicating, but nothing prepared me for what happened with Agnes. It's been over 30 years since I've worked as an embalmer, and believe me, I've seen it all in this line of work. Bodies that seem to whisper, objects that move on their own, that feeling of a chill down your neck when you know you're alone. But you're not. But Agnes's case, a lady in her 70s, was different. It was the first time I'd ever seen a corpse move after being embalmed. It was a quiet night at the morgue, one of those where the silence weighs heavier than the smell of formaldehyde. I was preparing Agnes's body for the wake. Everything normal. I'd already cleaned her, applied the products, closed the incisions. All that was left was to dress her and arrange her hands in a natural position, you know, like she was just sleeping. I placed her hands over her chest, covered them with a white cloth, and went to fetch the clothes her family had left. When I returned, I didn't notice anything strange at first. But something made me look again. The cloth covering her hands. It wasn't in place anymore. It had slipped a bit as if someone had pulled it. And worse, her hands, which I had placed crossed over her chest, were now loose, one beside her body and the other slightly tilted, as if pointing toward the door. My blood ran cold. I'm not a man who scares easily, but at that moment my heart raced. This can't be, I thought. Maybe I had made a mistake. Maybe the hands weren't as well positioned as I thought. I took a deep breath and approached, pulling the cloth completely off. There was no mistake. I had placed her hands over her chest, and now they were in completely different positions. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at that body as if it might rise at any moment. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. It was Paul, another embalmer, a guy who's worked with me for years and seen just as many strange things as I have. He entered the room and saw me standing there, staring fixedly at Agnes. Problem there, buddy? He asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't know how to explain, so I just pointed. Her hands, they weren't like that. Paul took a look, frowned, but didn't seem surprised. So today it's her causing trouble. Her who? I asked, not quite understanding. This one here, Agnes. The folks at the cemetery had mentioned she was different. He lowered his voice as if someone might be listening. Her son came to do the paperwork and let slip that the old lady was always a bit of a witch. They say she talked to spirits, did some strange work. And look, after everything we've seen here, do you really think that's impossible? I didn't answer, because he was right. I'd seen worse things. But before I could say anything else, a shrill noise echoed from the other side of the room. It was a stack of plastic trays, the kind we use to organize instruments. They were stacked high on a cabinet, well secured, or at least they should have been. Because suddenly, they all fell to the floor at once, scattering as if someone had given them a push. Paul and I exchanged glances. There was no wind, no one nearby. And the worst part? The trays had fallen toward the table where Agnes was lying. We stood in silence for a while, until Paul let out a sigh. Well, at least she didn't sit up in the coffin this time. I looked at him. This time? He just smiled, as if he'd already accepted that some things in this job will never make sense. Man, you're not ready to hear the stories I have. And I knew he was right. Because there, in that cold room lit by fluorescent lights, one thing was certain. Agnes wasn't finished with what she came to do. And I had the feeling that night was going to get much, much worse. We tried to pretend nothing happened, but the morgue that night had a different energy, as if the air was charged with something we couldn't see. Paul and I went back to work, but you could feel the tension. Every normal sound, the creak of a door, the hum of the fridge, seemed like a warning. Even the clock on the wall sounded louder, as if it were counting down the seconds until the next surprise. I was adjusting Agnes's dress when I felt a chill on the back of my neck. Not the usual cold from the air conditioning, but something more intentional, like someone had blown gently. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was only Paul on the other side of the room, organizing the instruments. That's when the light flickered. It wasn't an electrical issue. It was a flicker, as if someone had passed in front of the lamp. But there was no one there. Paul stopped what he was doing and looked up slowly. We stared at each other, and I saw on his face the same question I was thinking. Did you see that too? Before we could speak, the radio on the counter turned on by itself. It was an old radio, one of those battery-powered ones we sometimes left on to break the silence, but it had been off for hours, and now it was blaring loud static, punctuated by whispers that were impossible to understand. Paul went over and tried to turn it off, but the button didn't respond. The static grew louder until, out of nowhere, a woman's voice, thin and drawn out, came from the device. Not over yet. Paul yanked the radio from the outlet and threw it on the table. The room fell silent again, but now it felt like we weren't alone anymore. Even Agnes's body seemed different. I can't explain it, but her expression was no longer peaceful. It was almost as if she were annoyed. That's when the coffin started to drag. It was a slow movement, almost imperceptible, but I saw the wooden base sliding a few centimeters across the floor on its own. Paul looked at me, pale. Bro, I don't think she wants to go to the wake. I didn't know what to do. I prayed mentally, asking Agnes to rest in peace, promised we'd take good care of her body, but the energy in the room only got worse. The lights flickered again, and this time the cabinet door behind us swung open with a sharp bang. That was the last straw. Paul took a rosary from his pocket. Yes, the guy carried a rosary to work, and placed it on Agnes's chest. It's time to go, ma'am. Your people are waiting. And then, everything stopped. The air warmed, the lights stabilized, and that invisible weight disappeared. Even Agnes's face relaxed, as if she had finally accepted something. We finished the job in silence, not mentioning what had happened. When the family came to pick up the body the next day, I almost told them everything. But I decided to stay quiet. Some stories you carry alone. To this day, when I pass by that morgue at night, I feel a chill. Because I know the dead sometimes aren't ready to go. And Agnes? She just wanted to make sure we'd hear her one last time. What a horror. What did you think of the story? What rating from 0 to 10 would you give it? Leave your thoughts here in the comments. The first time I felt that invisible hand pulling the elevator to the 5th floor, I almost dropped the body on the ground. Working the night shift in the ICU was already tough. Fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, the silence broken only by the beeping of monitors. But the worst part was when a patient didn't make it, and I had to take the body to the morgue in the basement. It was a macabre ritual, but I was used to it. Until that night. The patient was an elderly woman in her 80s, Rosemary Fletcher. Skin thin as paper, white hair still tied in a weak ponytail. She had no family there, no one to say goodbye. Just me, the doctor on duty, and that heavy silence after the heart monitor turned into a flat line. I wrapped the body in a white sheet, adjusted the stretcher, and entered the service elevator. That elevator was old, one of those that creaks, with lights that flicker as if deciding whether or not to give up working. I pressed the basement button and felt the jolt of the mechanism engaging. That's when things got strange. The elevator descended normally to the 8th floor. Then, on the 7th, it gave a slight jolt, as if someone had pressed the button to get in. But there was no one in the corridors. I checked, and when we reached the 6th floor, the air turned icy. Not the usual cold from the air conditioning, but something that clung to the skin, as if passing through a curtain of frozen air. And then, without any explanation, the elevator stopped on the 5th floor. The door opened slowly, with that creak that sounded like a moan. In front of me, the maternity ward corridor, empty. Dim lights, walls painted light blue, that nighttime hospital silence. But something was wrong. The 5th floor was blocked outside visiting hours. The service elevator didn't stop there without a special key, and I didn't have that key. My heart raced. I looked at the stretcher, at the body covered by the sheet, and then at the corridor again. That's when I noticed the smell. A faint perfume of talc and lavender, something like a grandma's scent. And the worst part? The sheet had moved. Not much, just a slight adjustment, as if someone had breathed deeply beneath it. I was about to press the button to close the door when I heard it. Tap, 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 footsteps. Light, like someone barefoot, coming from the end of the corridor. My blood turned to ice. The elevator door wouldn't close. The button didn't respond, and the footsteps were getting closer. That's when the head nurse, Nancy, appeared out of nowhere, holding a key. "What are you doing here?" she asked, eyes wide. Before I could answer, she looked at the stretcher, then at the empty corridor, and let out a heavy sigh. Oh no. It was her, wasn't it? Who? I swallowed hard. Nancy entered the elevator and inserted the key into the panel. Rosemary Fletcher. She worked here on the 5th floor for over 30 years. Neonatal nurse. They say she knew every nook of this place, even after death. The door finally closed, and the elevator started descending again. But the lavender scent was still there, and I swear that when I looked at the sheet again, it wasn't as taut over Rosemary Fletcher's face, as if she had turned her head to look at me. The elevator continued descending, but the air inside it felt heavier and heavier. Nurse Nancy remained silent, her eyes fixed on the panel, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. I couldn't take my eyes off the sheet covering Rosemary Fletcher's body. That lavender scent was still there, mixed with the cold that made my fingers tingle. When the doors opened in the basement, the morgue corridor was deserted. Only the dim light of the emergency lamps and that silence that seems to swallow even footsteps. I pushed the stretcher out, but the elevator didn't close. It stayed there, doors open as if waiting. Nancy looked at me and whispered, "Sometimes they don't want to go." I swallowed hard. Is she haunting the elevator? The nurse shrugged, but her eyes were serious. Rosemary Fletcher loved this hospital, worked here her whole life. They say some spirits get stuck where they were happiest, or where they left things unfinished. We started pushing the stretcher down the corridor, and that's when I heard it. A laugh. Soft, almost imperceptible, like a baby's rattle. My heart stopped. I looked at Nancy, but she didn't react. Had I imagined it? We reached the morgue door, and when I tried to open it, the handle was icy. Not cold. Icy, as if it had been left in a freezer. Nancy handed me the key, but when I tried to turn it, it jammed. That's when the sheet slipped. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't the movement of the stretcher. Someone pulled it. The cloth fell to the floor, revealing Rosemary Fletcher's face. Her eyes were closed, her skin pale, but her mouth. She no longer had that serene expression of someone who died in peace. Her lips were slightly curved. A smile. Nancy let out a little scream and stepped back. I almost fell backward, but then, tap, tap, tap. The same footsteps as before coming from the end of the corridor, but now they were closer. And with them, the sound of a rattle swaying gently. Nancy grabbed my arm. "You have to take her inside, now." With trembling hands, I forced the key. The morgue door finally opened, and we ran inside, pulling the stretcher behind us. When the door slammed shut, the sound echoed like thunder. Inside, the morgue was empty. Just the metal drawers and that smell of formaldehyde. But the air was different, heavy, as if something or someone had entered with us. Nancy was breathing fast, her eyes glazed over Rosemary Fletcher's body. Sometimes, they just want one last visit. That's when the light flickered. Once, twice, on the third flicker when everything went dark for a second, I swear I saw someone standing next to the stretcher. A short figure dressed in white with gray hair loose. I only had time to widen my eyes before the light returned. When the brightness filled the morgue again, the stretcher was empty. Rosemary Fletcher's body had vanished. Nancy screamed. I looked everywhere, but there was no sign of her. Just the sheet fallen on the floor, and a last scent of lavender dissipating into the air. We ran out of there. That day, no one ever saw Rosemary Fletcher's body again. Not in the morgue, not in the elevator, not on the 5th floor. But to this day, when the service elevator stops by itself at the maternity ward, the older staff whisper, "She just wanted to take one more turn." And if you listen closely, sometimes you can still hear the rattle. If you've made it this far, it's because these stories have gripped you in a way that's hard to explain. There are things that happen in these morgues that go far beyond what we can understand, and those who have experienced something like this know. So if you enjoy this kind of dark tale, with mystery and presences that don't rest even after death, subscribe to the channel to keep listening to more stories like these. And leave a comment saying, "I made it to the end," just so I know who made it through to the last second. If you felt that strange energy in the air while watching, give it a like. It's a sign that the connection was real. And, hey, there's a video right here that dives even deeper into this atmosphere. Click and come with me.